Hi everyone and welcome to SAMA. SAMA is a program where we invite an expert to talk about their area of expertise. This week we're lucky to have Fabrizio del Tin with us. He's going to talk to us about the Rife machine and how they truly work. Now Fabrizio is a Rife researcher at the EU University in Italy. He comes from a technical background and he excels in many fields, including investigative journalism, demodossology, chemistry, music, and music therapy. After decades of devoting his time to Rife research, he has decided it is time to disclose recent discoveries in the field of Royal Rife. As you may well know, in the 1930s, Royal Raymond Rife could observe viruses live with a special optical microscope at still unsurpassed magnifications. He further developed a beam ray device that destroys the pathogens by targeting their chemical constituents. And in this episode, Fabrizio is going to reveal how Royal Rife's machines worked. So welcome, Fabrizio, to our show.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here to be able to talk of these findings. So I prepared a presentation and we will walk through it and we will discuss and see what we are doing.
Wonderful. Now, this is very exciting, everybody, because Fabrizio has actually discovered how Royal Rife's machines work. When Royal Rife was making his equipment, he found frequencies and settings that worked, but he didn't truly understand the science, really why it worked. And so this is why we're all so excited to hear what Fabrizio say.
Yes, indeed, we think Rife used all the instruments available at his time, but there was not so much progress that he could measure the things he was seeing in an objective way. He resorted to the MOR, mortal oscillatory rates, but we find this was only a way of representation. It was not the real working principle. So now I will start the presentation. So why did we choose a prism as the first picture? Because we have to understand every Rife machine was directly connected to his microscope. They were working in a tandem. We cannot think separately about them. If we don't understand how his microscope was working, we cannot understand how his machine was working either. So here we have a prism and we see it separates light. The Rife microscope was working as a sort of monochromator, which means it was splitting the color of light, and he was staining a microbe under his microscope just with one single wavelength.
That's remarkable. So he could use a single wavelength and see the changes in the amplitude of that wavelength. Is this how he was using the prism system?
Yes, let's see. In full light, you cannot see the phenomenon because he was using refraction. His microscope was basically a polarizing microscope using for like petrographic research, and those are refracting microscopes. This means you input a high wavelength and the output is a lower wavelength. This was what allowed Rife to observe live a microorganism which normally cannot be observed because it falls much higher in the spectrum.
I understand.
So his machine had to be able to produce the same spectral content of the microscope in order to shatter the microscope. I'm sorry, the microbe.
Yes.
We will see this in detail how it works. So now let's go to the first slide. What is Rife Lab? Well, initially Rife called his lab the Rife Lab. Later, as he was having problems with justice, he wanted to keep a low profile, and the name was changed to Life Lab. Actually, we wanted to give a tribute to Rife research, and we are continuing into his research, and that's why in our university, which is a no-profit foundation located in Italy, we decided to open a branch and title it Rife Lab. And there we conduct experimentation over pathogens, and we just confirm what he was doing, and now I can say we went a step really farther because we could identify all his exact frequencies, and so we can build some plasma tubes which can broadcast the entire spectrum of his frequencies at once. So we are at a point we don't need anymore to have the Morse or a Morse list.
Now, this is beyond exciting, everybody, because what Fabrizio is saying is that he's discovered really the basis of how Royal Rife's machines worked. And I guess you'll be going and explaining how to replicate his results, or hopefully you will do later on in this presentation. But an understanding is fundamental, because with understanding, then you can improve, or you can at least replicate. So
yes,
this is very, very exciting.
We won't go into so much detail because it would be too technical, but we will give the general background so people can understand, I think for the first time, this phenomenon. And of course, we expect it shakes the Rife community because I will be saying things which are against common understanding. But in the truth, we want to add, not to subtract. So we think we are just adding the missing link that makes a Rife machine work how it should be, in one shot or in a few minutes.
Yes, yes, as it was historically recorded. Now, there's nothing wrong with shaking the cage, so to speak. It's hard to argue with science, and so if you've got facts to back up what you're stating, then this is extremely exciting.
Yes, it is. So the lab at the university, led by me, Fabrizio del Tin, is dedicated to the study and further development of Rife work. Who was Raymond Royal Rife? Well, we can find a lot of information depending on which websites you are looking to. Trying to summarize, he was a contested American researcher who developed a high magnification optical microscope and a machine that could devitalize microorganisms. We said contested because, as everybody is aware, you just need to look on Wikipedia, and it does not give a good image of Rife. They say he is a pseudo-scientist, which means he used a fake science. and that's not what we feel, and we can prove what he was really doing. His work never went from the lab to the masses, despite some preliminary tests on human beings were conducted. This we have also to recognize, because Rife always said, my work is very initial and much more work has to be done.
Mm.
Mostly he worked in vitro. This means behind his microscope. Applications on actually animals or humans were very limited. Of course, yes, he was using many rats and conducting biopsies, but that's a little different from going to a real production on living people.
Mm.
We had evidence, you know, the extraordinary success he had in the what was it, 1938 clinic, when he healed many patients. It was much speculated. Did they all have cancer? No, they did not have cancer. Everybody, some had issues with their eyes or other things. So we don't have a clear record or a clear number of how many patients had actually cancer and were healed. Second thing, at that time, you did not have really anesthesia, so you could not split a person, take a sample, and determine if his machine was working or not. So what was the praxis at his time? They just found outstanding cancers, tumors, which were external. They could see them, measure them by sight.
Mm.
They did not need to use surgery to go inside the person. So healing something which is outside, it's much easier, because it's like using the microscope, putting a slide under the microscope. The beam from the beam right is very direct. It reaches straight to the point. Instead, if he were to deal, for example, with a real lung cancer, which is inside, deep inside in the body, shielded by the ribs, so we have no track record of this, and it's very doubtful his ray could go through the bones, actually.
I believe that he did some test on horse meat.
Yes,
And
I remember that.
And he was testing the penetration there. But the problem, of course, with Royal Rife is a lot of his documentation was destroyed.
Yes.
And so we lost a lot of goodness from that.
But in the truth, there is a mix of effects. So even if one does not work, which is the one which is very quick to destroy microorganisms, there are other means which are slower but can reach deeper into the skin.
Okay.
So we will see everything. So as a result of a modern revival, many have followed into his footsteps, but his secrets remain buried in his grave, as nobody could replicate his track of records till recently. I say this because many talk about great results and healings from Rife machines, but there is no scientific protocol or testing which was done. So we can accept those stories, but scientifically we don't have a clear evidence, and everybody will recognize Rife machines do help, can help prolong your life without pains many times. It can alleviate the symptoms, but there is a point when the illness usually hits back with a higher strength and there is nothing to do anymore. So it works like helping increasing self-defenses, getting a few months, maybe some year more of life, but it does not solve what Rife was claiming, which is complete destruction of microorganisms, which also means complete healing. We have to discriminate between those two things.
Okay.
Now, from Rife research, a lot of lists came out. People did not understand exactly how it was supposed to work, so we find really expanded lists which are sold also on the market. To name a few, somebody says it can heal my broken nail, my insomnia, my allergy, my asthma, my fibrosis, my flatulence, my lumbago, and may come up in your mind.
Mm.
In the true, for a strictly point of view, well, don't forget we do Rife research, so we keep to Rife. We don't. We are not analyzing the bigger picture in this moment. So, well, other things might work also, but strictly from a Rife point of view, there is a big no. He was not dealing with those things. Rife only dealt with a limited number of severe pathogens, and we have the lists of those. They are very few microorganisms, so we keep strict to those one.
Okay.
Actually, the image in the background is showing one's bowels, and in the middle of it we see a cancer. So Rife identified a virus associated with breast cancer and targeted it with his machine. Actually, he was choosing ulcerated pieces of breast cancers and he was extracting samples from there, which means a cancer which burst outside of the person externally. He could see it, there were fissures, and he could take live samples directly from the person without needing surgery again to go inside and find it.
Okay.
Anyway, he stopped short of claiming that he could cure cancer, but he did argue that he could devitalize diseased organisms in living tissue, with certain exceptions. Now, this sentence is very deep and it summarizes his entire work. A Rife machine can do a lot, it cannot do all, and it has severe limitations. So we need to be aware of those limitations, and that's also our study, how to minimize those limitations and maximize the result. Electrotherapy, radionics, frequency resonance. What were Rife machines really about? In one word, none of the above. Now here I take the description from Wikipedia, where they define Rife instruments as electrotherapy and radionics. That's completely misunderstood. I will expand also. We have another very good instrument which is called violet ray or violet wand, and they classify it as an electrotherapy device. Well, if you use it in contact with the skin, it just transmits current, so it is an electrotherapy device. But you would not need a plasma electrode. You could just use a strip of copper and put it on the skin of the patient.
Right.
I say you could use an electrode which is not of plasma. You could use a gel electrode or a copper electrode or anything like that. So why using a plasma tube? Well, I think we are among the first who measured the spectrum of a violet ray, and we found some wavelengths which are very similar to the one used in the early Rife machines. Actually, in an age when antibiotics still did not exist, you didn't have any way of healing from very, very simple illnesses. A violet ray could be used as a sterilizer because it produced the UV ultraviolet light, and this could kill the germs where you were applying it over the skin. So this is just to mention an example that Wikipedia and the general scientific community takes it completely wrong. They saw only a part of the machine, and they lost the big picture and what else the machine could do and could produce.
Okay.
So Rife devices are currently classified as a subset of radionics devices, which are generally viewed as pseudo-medicine by mainstream experts. This is due to the fact that only post-Rife devices were examined. Examples are Phil Hoyland machines, John Crane pad devices, Vern Thompson's machines, John Bear systems, etc. Nobody has ever examined early Rife machines. The only ones that passed successfully clinical trials and worked according to Rife's original tenets. We know that since Hoyland made his tube version of a Rife machine, Rife was very skeptical. He said, "It does not abide to my tenets." Then he saw it was somehow working. Somehow we know from records that half of the time it was working, half of the time it was not.
Right.
They were attributing to it a difficulty to stabilize the voltage. They say the voltage swing was affecting the output, and the machine was not working in a reliable way. And they find a lot of excuses, but they never fixed this. We have the certainty that only early Rife machines were working according to Rife's initial tenets.
Okay.
Now, we put a disclaimer because we seem to go against the entire world. So we are not against modern Rife machines. I have to pull this down, which were inspired by Rife but went through other paths of research. An outstanding example is Anthony Holland, who is investigating cancer cell shattering through an improved Bayer device. And indeed, he is obtaining results. However, to abide to Rife principles, a machine needs to clear off a pathogen in a single flash or within maximum 3 minutes using a particular mix of concurrent effects. No current modern Rife machines can climb that, and it normally takes hours to achieve any minimal effect. It may bring some temporary relief, but it cannot achieve its goal in the long term. We can see, for example, Anthony Holland's track of record, and he's exposing his cultured cells for hours, even days. So he might well have found an interesting new path of research, but Rife was not keeping his samples 24 hours before seeing an effect.
Right. Can I ask you a question, Fabrizio?
Yes.
In one of the Rife lab videos, it shows Royal Rife turning on a plasma machine and turning it off straight away. It must be less than a second. Was that a split film, or was it truly a instantaneous application of a frequency, then returning to his slide, his microscope, and observing his pathogens immobilized?
Okay. Yes, we could duplicate the vitalization just in one shot. If you have the correct energy level, you don't need to wait. It really works in one shot.
That's very exciting. So what you're saying is that currently Rife machines are killing microbes through boredom rather than through the right methodology.
I'm sorry, I did not get.
Well, if you've got the frequencies being applied for hours, they're going to be dying
Okay.
of boredom rather than through frequency resonance or any sort of power transfer.
Part transfer. Okay. No, I'm not able to answer because my English is not so perfect.
Okay.
So
I'm sorry.
I cannot follow exactly what you mean.
Well, it sounds very exciting what you're saying, so we'll move on from here.
Okay. So let me continue. I apologize also if I have a terrible Italian accent.
Well, I apologise in advance for my terrible New Zealand accent. Your English is great and you're doing well. Everyone can understand you, so please continue.
Okay. So, did Rife have a secret? Why could nobody replicate, even Rife's later assistant John Crane, the effects of the original earlier Rife machines? Did earlier Rife machines really produce the climate wonders, or was it all hype? Now we start with some more technical background. Many think the effect is due to some form of resonance. They describe like the singer who is singing a high note and breaking a glass because it enters in resonance with the note sung by the singer. Many talk about possible harmonics and say maybe we don't know the correct frequency, but if we go up some harmonics, maybe we hit the right one. So we have to say a word about this. The dimensions of the BX, which was called the cancer virus, vary from 40 nanometers. The size of its head starts from 24 nanometers to about 10 micrometers. So we know Rife was targeting chemical constituents. Chemical constituents mean molecules. Even if we consider that, for example, the capsid of a microorganism was mainly constituted by a certain constituent, so we take it as a whole and we get a much bigger size. We are still below the 40 nanometers or 24 nanometers. If we talk about molecules, then we go much smaller. So if we convert the wavelengths of 10 to 2 micrometers to frequencies, I reduced the number because I'm saying a capsid does not contain only a single molecule. It contains a mix of chemical constituents. So I'm taking a smaller fraction just in case.
Okay.
So we have from 29.9792458 petahertz to 149, etc. terahertz. So we see there is no way to use even the highest more of earlier Rife machines, which was 1 megahertz and 600 kilohertz to hit a petahertz. Simply they are too distant. Why is that? With a square wave or a triangle wave, every time you get a higher harmonic, the power becomes a half. So if you have such a distance and every time you halve the power, you end up with zero power. So that's why there is no way that a mortal oscillatory rate or audio or radio frequencies can have any form of impact over the size of the microorganisms in terms of resonance.
That's in terms of the Hertzian resonance. If we're looking at longitudinal resonance, we're talking about cellular mass and the response to the mass, which is pretty much analogous to shaking.
Yes, yes, it has shaking effects. Now we will explain that better also.
Okay.
Okay, anyway, even using harmonics, it's impossible to have such a power to go from a megahertz to a petahertz. Thus, we can exclude any form of resonance. In the next slide, we see what is a rotational transition, a vibrational, what we were saying before, shaking the microorganism.
Yes.
Now, if we shake a microorganism with an audio frequency or radio frequency, it's like having an earthquake, a very deep earthquake under the earth, which is shaking all the streets, buildings, and ants, people, animals, anything. Okay, they are shaken, but they survive unless a wall falls on their head. No?
Okay. But
Okay.
shaking can produce a standing wave, surely, a percussion standing wave in an ion channel of a cell.
Yes, but standing wave, I also study semantic.
Yes.
And a standing wave in that distance is unlikely to hit in the nodal point the exactly the microbe. You need a much shorter net of standing nodes to have an impact. Now, the electromagnetic spectrum ranges from audio frequencies, from what we hear, to microwaves, to vision. We have to say that vision and hearing are two organs we have which detect the same effect in nature, which is electromagnetism. When we go up through the spectrum, you see below at microwave levels, we have rotational transitions. Microwaves effectively can cause the rotation of water molecules. And that's why when you put your food in a microwave, it heats up. It builds up through, we can call it a rotational resonance.
Okay.
When you go higher, now you approach the far infrared and infrared, you don't have only rotation, you have always also vibration and transitions. What does that mean? The microorganisms does not only start to circle around, but starts to shake really. And here we are close to the visible area. We are very far from audio frequencies or Morse. So that's why we say Rife might have had a secret, because Morse were not the real secret or cause of devitalizing the microorganisms. There was something more. Now, when you reach the visible and you go up to the UV, ultraviolet, you see electronic transitions, vibrational, fine structure. What does this mean? Fine structures are exactly the chemical constituents of microorganisms. It's not anymore the earthquake shaking anything in the next 30 miles. You are operating at the microorganism level. You shake directly the sites and you have a resonance directly with the microorganism. And there is more. Ultraviolet also causes electronic transitions. This means Rife was saying, I target the chemical constituents, I target molecules. If you have an electronic transition, this means the molecules change their structure, change their chemical formula, make new compounds, and instantly the capsid disintegrates, because the bonds between the molecules are severed.
That's interesting, but that's quite dangerous energy levels, surely.
Yes, it's quite dangerous, but we will see the entire story, then we will be able to judge better.
Okay.
Okay, the beam Rife machine. Rife called his machine beam Rife, not frequency instrument. Beam and ray all refer to wavelengths, not frequencies, which fall much lower in the electromagnetic spectrum. A beam ray uses very high power levels, unlike modern replicas, as it can be witnessed by the electron sputtering in the image at the right, where the beam exits the glass. Now I will move here a little. Okay. Now, in this original beam ray, first you notice the electrodes are very, very close to each other, which means you need less power and you can concentrate the energy in a much smaller spot. Now, bring me a modern Rife machine where you see actually a beam exiting the glass. The most I have seen is a beam between the two electrodes, making like a straight line. But I never saw the action that Rife described of a mirror, which forces the beam to exit perpendicularly out of the glass. In this image, you see it very clearly where the beam is exiting the glass, because there is electron sputtering and also devitrification. The glass changes a little its structure because of the intensity of the beam. So this gives an idea of what Rife was really doing, which is a little different from modern machines.
If you look at the orientation of the electrodes, it's hard to see how the beam could exit at that point through the angle of incidence.
Not really. You see the upper disk, which is bent approximately 45 degrees. And straight on the left, you see the brown spot. And that's how the mirror acts. You see a black spot on the bottom also because that's the alignment of the two electrodes. So some beam was escaping one of the electrodes and hitting there too. We don't have to forget that this plasma globe was made by hand. You see electrodes, they are not professional, they are bent by hand, so they have a tolerance which is high, so it's not very precise.
In the documentation which is readily available today, they generally purport to the Rife machines not being that powerful. And in fact, Royal Rife was quoted, whether it's true or not, as stating that high powers are not necessary and indeed may be dangerous. It's hard to, of course, know what is the true source and legitimate information and what has been fabricated through the course of years.
Yeah, let's say you have to go to the truth, to what does the job. If what you have does not do the job and does not comply with Rife's descriptions, perhaps it's not correct. In the true, you don't need a very high power if you know how to configure the entire parameters of the machine. I mean the electrical parameters. If you have the correct filling, the correct pressure, the correct distance between electrodes, and also the correct Moore, because the Moore is the one which can shift the wavelengths. We will see more of this later on. You can do it. Even 30 watts may be enough for achieving the purpose.
Okay. Because the box itself hasn't got much cooling, certainly not in the photo anyway. It's got a few small holes in the top. Maybe it's got slots in the back. But for machine that may be designed to work next to a wall, it certainly doesn't seem to have much.
Okay, the thing of the cooling is something we tried also. Technically, you are not in the need to use such big plasma balloons. You can use like today we have flash lamps, flash tubes.
Yes.
They are very narrow. They can be with an inner diameter of 3-4 millimeters, and those heat a lot, of course, because the plasma touches the glass envelope actually.
Yes.
So the purpose of having such a big ball was exactly this. The plasma is confined inside in the middle of the ball, and the surrounding air makes like an insulator. And so you perceive like the tube is running cool. But in the true, in the middle, it's running at the correct plasma levels.
Okay.
Okay. Rife did not use the term wavelengths. Instead, he used the term frequencies or frequencies of light. If you check his patents or any other documents, very, very rarely he mentions wavelengths. He always talks about frequencies of light or just frequencies. This led to confusion because all thought that the working principle was in frequencies, low frequency to radio frequency, or mortal oscillatory rates instead of wavelengths.
The documentation I've seen has got wavelengths as well. He's talking about 80 meters and less than 1/4% is the tolerance in wavelengths. So
yes,
I think there's certainly a lot of confusion there.
You have to read all Rife documentation with an eye of the age when they were written. Otherwise, if you try to use the modern words or scientific words, reading his documents, you won't come up with what he was doing.
Okay.
So what were Moores for then? We are quoting, you need to understand that you must mimic the microscope in what it does to light up the virus so you can see them. The machine must work on the same principle as the microscope. John Crane to John Bedini. An electronic gun and a reflector target. Rife Thomson patent application. Now, I have somewhere another point where Rife describes his beam Rai as a plasma gun, an electron gun. I couldn't find the exact place where he wrote this, but I'm sorry. Basically, mortal oscillatory rates are frequencies used to pump a plasma tube like an electron gun so that it can emit a certain band of wavelengths. So what are we saying here? That's common laser knowledge today. An electron gun is a common thing, and it's just a plasma tube which is pumped by a frequency, which is a more, to shift the spectrum. To use it in any scientific application nowadays. So today we have the equations, we have the knowledge, and we have the know-how to build Rife machines, how they should be. Now we will see exactly how this works. A real beam ray mimics what nowadays we call tunable lasers. However, at the time, lasers were not available yet. Therefore, flash lamp technology was used. Flash lamps are the precursors of lasers.
Can tunable lasers go down to 24 to 40 nanometers required for BX?
I never investigated lasers exactly. We have been working with flash lamps, and we can go to 180 nanometers, which is far below what Rife was using.
Yes, but if he was targeting BX, you mentioned before that the wavelength of the size of the BX is between 40 nanometers and 24 nanometers. And so to replicate that effect using a different method, the whatever particle generator you use has got to transmit using those incredibly short wavelengths, which I'm not sure that's possible with tunable lasers. So maybe still the only answer is using a plasma tube in some form of modulation in the form of frequencies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but before thinking about that, I have to say the story is not complete yet, because that's what we were first looking for. Something which could be reconducted to the sites of the microorganisms. And in the truth, we found a way to transpose every more list to the minimal size of a microorganisms. And we have the same curve in our diagrams. No? So we found a match. But later we had to discard this because Rife was using refractometry. So he was targeting single molecules, and there is no law.
I seem to have lost you, Fabrizio.
It's completely random. Okay. So you have actually to measure it. You have to go through lab study and find it the hard way. There is no shortcut. So you have to see where a molecule refracts. When you give an excess of energy, you know what refraction is.
Yes.
A molecule gets a certain beam of light or wavelength, let's say. It can absorb some of it, which becomes heat, and this is very similar to resonance, but it can release some. A perfect resonance would be it cannot hold the charge anymore until it breaks. Well, Rife was not using this. Rife was needed to see under his microscope what was happening. So the molecule was hitting and reaching its critical limit, but at the same time it was refracting a part of light at a different wavelength. It acts like a filter, and this was bringing to the visible the molecule. So the BX, which you can see because it's so small, because of refraction, you could see it because the targeted molecule was broadcasting a refracted beam in the visible area. So what happens when you exceed the power handling of refraction? You get a shattering. So this is basically how it was working. Now let's go back to the screen. We can go to the next one. Still in the general consideration. What is a phanatron? A phanatron is a modern term invented by post-Rife developers. Rife never used one. So here at the right, we see a true phanatron. It's a diode. It has nothing to do with what we use today to run Rife machines. What Rife was using, the closest thing was a Coolidge universal X-ray tube, which is pictured in the background. And here we see the original Rife tube, which he used throughout his early research. We see on top, on the right, this same tube, which is in the background. This is a preferred safety X-ray tubes, and we were the first ones to find this out.
It's a beautiful tube, isn't it?
Yes. Those were made actually in soda glass, but the window, you see there is the mirror at 45 degrees, and down there is a sort of cylinder. On top of that cylinder, there is a window in quartz or something which has more transmittance. You can see the power levels of early Rife machines. Look at the image on top on the right, and it's completely black. Even this tube in the background, which was used barely, not so much, is already darkened. So this means the power level needs to be appropriate. In this case, the distance between the two electrodes is quite big. So the power used in those early machines were much higher than in Hoyland or modern Rife machines. Those X-ray tubes were not vacuum tubes, but contained 14 torr of air. So Rife substituted the air with 14 torr of helium. Helium can pass a spectral bandwidth down to about 220 nanometers. In comparison, xenon can pass a spectral band down to about 250 nanometers. So it would not hit the BX, for example.
Okay, now the BX is still lower than 220, so there's something else at play.
No, it's a bit higher than 220. But we don't give it, but I can say that's why we found the whole thing, because Rife gave the chemical constituents of the BX. So we could analyze those constituents, and from there we were able to map his entire absolute Morse.
Okay.
Okay, what tubes can be used nowadays? The closest thing to an early Rife tube is that that is commercially available nowadays is quartz DC arc tubes. They can be used also in pulsed mode. Only electrodes won't withstand so long. But basically, every tube Rife used in his life was a DC tube. So he always used the DC tubes improperly. We can do that too because materials today are much better than at Rife's time. So we have a better chance of designing working machines that have a much longer life.
Okay, so you're saying that the earliest Rife machines did not use any DC offset or DC carrier, if you like, to light the tube.
Yes, they all were DC carrier. Yes.
They were DC carrier.
Yes,
Okay.
because all X-ray production was made through DC at the time.
And he superimposed upon the DC the AC signal.
No, Rife never used the DC. He used a pulsed carrier wave plus a more. We will see a plot later on.
Okay.
So those modern arc tubes use a lot of energy because one like this picture in the background can easily need like 1 kilowatt to sustain the arc. The electrodes are not anymore like a mirror. They are not two discs. They are like cylinders at 45 degrees. This means they would broadcast at 45 degrees, but 360 degrees around the room where you are in. So you need to shield this and put some reflector which directs the beam and can focus it. Okay. This is a way, for example, to use a modern quartz DC tube.
Okay.
Okay. Here we have how a nearly Rife machine was supposed to work. It had two components. First, a high voltage underdamped carrier wave pulsed at around 1 kilohertz. This is simply a Tesla coil, let's say, a modified Tesla coil or a diathermy machine. In my books, I publish some schematics of original Fisher diathermy machines that Rife was using. Today, we would say this is very poor understanding of how a plasma tube should be driven. Nobody would use an underdamped carrier wave because it destroys quickly the components, the plasma tube also. There is a better way to do it now. But anyway, this is what Rife was using. So a Tesla coil plus a sine generator, which was in the audio or up to the radio waves. And this was the magic shape of his wave that was devitalizing microorganisms.
Okay.
Now, did Rife use only a single means to destroy microorganisms, or was there a mix of effects? Well, we found there are three main effects. One we called, maybe improperly, but it gives the idea, the optical effect. Then we have the electromagnetic effect, and then the thermal effect. Each of them contributes to microbial inactivation to a certain extent. They can be also used separately with differing germicidal effectiveness. The optical and thermal effects being the strongest and quickest ones. Now, there is also in this slide a reference to the material of the plasma tube. Below, on the right, you see glass filter. So, in this case, we used a xenon flash tube, and we put in front of it a glass filter, a soda glass filter. And you see that even if we were using very high powers on Bacillus subtilis, it was having no effect. It didn't kill it. With Pyrex, we could achieve some inactivation at very, very high power levels. You see, we did not even achieve 1 log of inactivation. Inactivation is calculated in a logarithmic way. If you reach what is called D90, or the destruction of 90% of the colony of microorganisms in 1 log, then you can say you are effective. Now you just change the filter, and you don't use a filter, you use simple fused quartz, and you see that with very small energy you achieve 4 logs of inactivation. When you increase actually the power of the machine, you don't get much of a difference. You don't get 5, 6, 7 logs. You stay close to the 4 logs. So that's why you can optimize the delivered energy or the power of the machine using the proper components, in which case is a quartz tube.
Just one thing I'd like you to ask you, Fabrizio. In the x-axis, you've got 5 kilowatts on the first division per centimeter. That's a terrific amount of energy.
Yes.
Am I reading that correctly?
Okay, you must know that we are talking about pulsed energy. So pulsed energy can reach 30,000 kilowatt in a fraction of a second. We are not talking about DC.
Okay. And so the instantaneous power delivery of the early Rife machines could reach those values. Wow. Okay.
Yes, this was what Rife was referring to as the spikes kill. That's a spike of power, all in a fraction of a second.
Okay, so is this why he had his machines running off battery to deliver the instantaneous power, as opposed to using reticulated power and capacitive banks, perhaps?
Yes, well, we also change the energy to DC before pulsing it. So,
Okay.
yes, you never use AC directly because you don't need 60 or 50 hertz. You need higher frequencies.
Yes, but I'm looking at the impedance of the supply to deliver 5 kilowatts per centimeter, the instantaneous power. It must be a very low impedance power supply. And generally, if you've got a AC that's going through a rectifier to make it DC and a bank of capacitors, you need to have quite a lot of capacitors to produce that instantaneous power, or perhaps a DC battery bank, which again have got very high short circuit capabilities. They can deliver the instantaneous energy, if you like.
But I don't think a battery bank would reach such intensity very quickly at the desired
Okay.
voltage, because you need to operate at high voltage also.
Okay.
I can say we have all the equations now, and if you calibrate correctly the parameters of the plasma tube, and I will say every plasma tube is manufactured by hand. You don't have two identical plasma tubes. Everyone has a difference between the positioning of the electrodes or the gas field or anything. No?
Sure.
So you need to calibrate every machine, and calculating the impedance of the plasma tube, you are able to couple the discharge from the capacitors at the correct impedance, and then decide in which fraction of a second you need that quantity of energy delivered at once. So you play on the timing. If you enlarge the timing, offsetting the answer from the inductance, then the beam lasts longer, but does not reach the required intensity. You need to tune it so that you have a real flash in a real fraction of a second. Usually we talk about, I think, 20 microseconds, something like this.
Gosh, well, if it's 20 microseconds and the frequencies that he was using was something like 1.6 megahertz, we're only talking about 30 cycles. And it might take about 10, 15 of those cycles to reach the peak amplitude. So it's very brief application times. Wow,
Yes.
this is ballpark calculations here.
Okay, let's continue. Oh, now we go exactly to describe the three effects. The optical effect. Rife was targeting the main chemical constituents, molecules, of microorganisms. Each molecule has its distinctive absorption spectrum and refracts light in a different way. The refractive wavelength allowing to stain a microorganism through coordination with its molecular composition, optical resonance, and see it in its complementary color, higher visible wavelength, can be used to devitalize it given the right power level. The optical effect is the main one in the mix, which is found in no modern Rife machine replica. It works mostly instantly, single hit operation, but it has low penetration. It links Rife's microscopes to his machines and is the real working principle.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Then we have the electromagnetic effect. The EM field is a secondary effect contributing with a vibrational and rotational force. Microorganisms are caught in the loop of the shaking effect and eventually become stressed, up to a point that their outer wall ruptures. This effect is made of the carrier wave and the Moore themselves. Depending on the carrier, skin impedance blocks certain frequencies, it may have either a better or worse penetration. The EM effect works randomly. When it has some effect, it takes hours. In the long term, it fails to produce consistent results as microorganisms develop resistance to it and adapt. And that's exactly the principle on which all modern Rife machines are built on.
Now you're saying skin impedance. Can you expand on that a little bit, please? Could you explain?
Yes, the electromagnetic effect is what is produced by the carrier plus the more waves. So as we said, it's like making an earthquake. In the skin, you know, the human tissue is very complex. That's why it is not readily affected by a Rife machine, but a virus, a bacteria, is a simple structure. That way, it is much more subject to shaking effect or vibration or anything that might happen. Anyway, we are talking here like the earthquake. So the structures in the body should start to dance, squeeze, move, vibrate, and mechanically squeeze the virus or the bacteria which it finds in the way, just by chance.
And so you're saying it's more like a macro effect, the complete
Yes,
virus.
it's a macro effect, exactly. It also has some other qualities because it stimulates the blood to circulate, the exchange of nutrients. The body has less work to do and is helped by this, and so you see like it has a nice reaction because the person feels better, feels energetic, but again it's like an earthquake, so it has a limited effect on the microorganisms.
And the skin impedance, we're not talking about human skin, we're talking about cellular membranes. Is
Yes.
that correct? Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay.
Here we have, yes, longitudinal waves or everything that is produced by an electromagnetic field. Then, this is one of the best ways, in my opinion, and there are patents. You know, there is also a company, Oncotherm in Germany, who are exploiting the thermal effect and putting also some Rife frequencies in the mix. pulsed bursts of electromagnetic waves induce heating. Unlike the heat from a fire, which heats from the outside to the inside, this effect starts from the inside and goes to the outside. Therefore, it has good penetration, the best one in the mix. The sudden heating leads to cell wall rupture in microorganisms. Cancer cells cannot dissipate heat well as normal cells do. Therefore, they die first. However, their thermal death point is very close to that of normal cells, requiring a perfect control of administered dose. The photothermal effect, optical plus thermal effect, is the workhorse of a Rife machine, but the thermal effect is a secondary effect of the electromagnetic one. The three do not come separate. So, thermal death of cancer cells, microorganisms, really works. The issue is that a few, how can I say, a few fractions of a degree, and you are killing normal cells also. So that's the big issue. But when the three effects are combined, you have a much stronger impact. Each effect helps the other one.
I'm looking at the graphic in the background, which is very interesting. It's talking about the penetration depth, and we're looking we're just getting past the skin of the subject, just through the epidermis, subcutaneous at the bottom there. And so it's really not getting through to any internal cancers if we're relying, well, I guess this must be for the optical side, the infrared B, infrared C, the A, B, and C.
Yes, truly it can penetrate till the muscles also.
But not much below that, not really to internal organs, and certainly not through bone.
Well, the issue is organs will contain a lot of liquids usually, you know?
Sure.
So this will shield that thermal effect and reduce it.
I understand. But the graph is indicating light, so it's more optical rather than thermal, I guess. And so
no, truly no. This schematics is about the thermal effect, not optical.
Okay.
Because this was taken from a parallel application. You might have heard about IPL lamps.
Yes, sure.
Okay, that's the same. If you want to build a one-shot Rife machine, just take an IPL machine, change the glass,
The filter.
remove the glass because it has already a quartz flash lamp.
Okay.
And go with that, and you would achieve all Rife's wavelengths at once.
But not at the powers though, because it's at so many frequencies that at each particular frequency, the energy will be insignificant.
No, the energy of IPL machines is very strong. It can literally melt your internal pores and hair, and it also produces a strong irritation on the skin. It becomes so red. You need to take painkillers. It's very strong.
No, I've actually I was thinking about a different machine, which is just basically a desk lamp with a filter in the front. But IPL, I recall now, but intense pulsed laser, and so it is very, very bright. But the wavelengths won't be broad spectrum, surely. I thought they'd be quite narrow, the wavelengths being transmitted.
Yes.
And it's still sufficient to do the same effect if you remove any filtering as a Rife machine.
Yes, you can filter and get what you want exactly, yes.
Wow, very interesting.
Okay, then we go to our lab experiments, how we found all this out. This is a quartz tube filled with helium, which was manufactured by Bill Cab in Canada, just for us under our specifications. It has, you don't see it from the light, but it has the electrodes exactly like Rife was using, two
Yes.
discs and one at 45 degrees.
Yes.
We didn't feel to do the big ball to dissipate the heat, and we have a wall stabilized plasma in this case. So with a lower more, you see the spectral output. We can say it is centered more around between 500 and 700, I would say. Those are the big peaks. The color is reddish, let's say, or pink.
And so just clarifying, the x-axis is nanometers. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Now we go to the next one, and you see a big change in color. We raised up the more, and it became very blue. The spectrum shows that it shifted almost around 200 nanometers.
Okay.
Now we have to say Rife tubes always emit a broad spectrum. You never have, like in a laser, a single bandwidth wavelength. I mean, you have all the previous wavelengths, but the spectral band shifts or changes.
Yes.
You can see from here. The first one, look up on the left how that spectral band rises.
Yes.
The other two peaks, the big ones on the right, stay there. Sorry, they become a little more empowered, but basically they are the same. What changes is that we are going toward UV, ultraviolet. Now, you know, Rife in the 20s was saying, unfortunately, I could not patent my discovery because somebody was quicker than me. Well, we have his original patents, and we know exactly why he was doing this and how he was shifting the spectrum.
Now he's using frequencies to shift the spectrum. Can the spectrum also be modified by controlling DC passing through a tube?
DC, I would not talk about DC. The best ways to control the spectrum are through voltage change, simply, which is the easiest. I think Rife chose the most complicated path, which is using Morse. You can do that, but I don't see it so precise as other ways. Or another way is to control the duty cycle of each pulse. With that, you don't need Morse anymore. You just work on the duty cycle and a single frequency or wavelength, let's say.
Okay.
So, what is a Rife machine? We know it is not radionics, it's not electrotherapy. Finally, it is a quantum machine. The beam incident upon a microorganism can be considered in terms of the number of its photons. It has photon density per unit surface area. The amount of energy a photon carries is called quantum. Absorption efficiency is called quantum yield. Molecular photoreaction requires a quantum yield in the order of 10 to the minus 3 to 10 to the minus 4. Electronic transitions take place only in discrete electronic jumps. Therefore, electrons can absorb only a specific quantum of energy. When we know exactly how much energy we need to use and at which wavelength, we can easily achieve microbial inactivation. Okay, what does this all mean? That's quite simple. Helium, Rife chose helium because he could use smaller powers. Helium only has few spectral lines. Spectral lines mean electronic jumps. How is a spectral line produced? The plasma receives a certain quantity of energy, which is enough to cause a shift from one orbital to another orbital of one electron. When the electron finds itself in a higher orbital, at a certain point, it loses the energy that pushed it there and falls back where it was before. When it falls back, it releases all the energy that it had acquired. By releasing this energy, it emits a quantum of light, and this is what we call the beam, the beam ray. When we talk about molecular photoreaction means that the capsid of a microorganism reacts to the beam, to the quantum yield which is hitting him. We need a certain quantity of quantum yield to cause the inactivation of the microorganism. It's a little bit technical, but I hope I can give the idea.
Well, again, it's talking about inactivating a macroorganism, albeit one cell, by causing a molecular photoreaction of a molecule within the cell.
Exactly. We are causing ionization. Exactly.
Yes. It is complex. It's spinning a few ideas on the head. Okay, but that's great. Okay.
Okay. So I see we're talking a lot of time, so we'll try to go quicker now. How does the optical effect work on targeted molecules? The absorption of quanta of light by a sample is accompanied by a change in the electronic state of its molecules. The energy supplied by the photons will push the electrons from their ground state orbitals to higher energy state orbitals, which is what I was talking before. When the supplied energy is absorbed but not released back, optical resonance, something must happen in the molecule. Heat can be released till it causes the thermal death of the microorganism. The molecules change their chemical bonds as they are unable to keep their previous structure. In this case, the radiation is called uniting. This leads to instability, cell wall rupture, disintegration. Okay.
Okay.
If it's all clear, I continue.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now, this is a plot for microbial inactivation. We see that we need really few photons to impair vision. When we go to viruses and bacteria, you see the energy, the quantity of photons is enormous. This means when we use a real Rife machine working on the optical effect, we must protect our body, our eyes from exposition to the beam ray. Otherwise, we can get harmed very badly.
Okay.
Selective depth, photoprotection. The more complex a cell is and the more photoprotection mechanisms it has, this is why animal cells are much more resilient than microbes. What we were saying before, human cells have a stronger structure.
Yes.
Microorganisms have powerful tools to protect, such as absorbing proteins, dark proteins, in the nucleocapsids and cytoplasm that can effectively shield the DNA. Beam scattering is another photoprotection mechanism. It is caused by the complexity of the cell, which prevents the beam from reaching its target effectively. Chromophores, mainly amino acids, purines, pyrimidines, are capable of absorbing photons. Those are all mechanisms a microorganism has to protect against a beam ray. Also, it becomes more resistant when it is about to die. So I only mentioning the big titles, but there is a long study on each of those things.
Okay.
Microbial defense, photoreactivation. Photoreactivation is important because we are hitting a microorganisms with a beam, but the same beam which is causing its death is also repairing it and prolonging its life. This happens also in human cells. If you get exposed to ultraviolet, from one side it damages you. From the other side, there are repairing mechanisms which take place and defend you from damage. So photoreactivation is the natural process through which microorganisms can partially recover from beam damage. VIS and UV light can reverse DNA damage, especially in more complex cells. Photoreactivation may take place also in obscurity, which is called dark repair. Enzymes, which might also be present in the host cell, can catalyze photoreactivation and help reduce the damage level. Bacillus anthracis has 1-2 logs higher survival rate due to photoreactivation. Okay, so reaching the end. What are absolute mores? If we have a set configuration of a beam ray, we would measure them in ampere per square centimeters. But actually, we can also refer to them as wavelength because they are the quantity of energy per square centimeter needed to shift the spectrum to that wavelength. More lists are many because they are calibrated on a specific machine. This means they are computed from the absolute mores against the parameters of the machine. The absolute more is a more that does not change with the machine. It is the working principle behind the more. We could measure it for the first time, as at Rife's time, the required instrumentation did not exist. Absolute mores are the same principle Rife used in order to tune the machine against the micropolariscope by eye. They are the current per square centimeter that is needed to center a certain spectral line around a spectral band that is enhanced by means of the applied more or by other means, for example, voltage. They all fall in the UVB, UVC, DUV region, which is also called vacuum UV. But Rife said he was not using UV. How come? Rife's words were correct. He never used UV, which at the time was obtained only by direct current means, DC. We find in his annotations all the effects of ultraviolet. He was a pioneer in PUV, pulsed UV, which has been described in some studies as having thrice the germicidal effectiveness of ordinary UV. Nowadays, PUV systems may have many names: UVGI, PWL, PWLD, PUVD, DUV, VUV, IPL, etc. PWLD means pulsed white light disintegration, as Rife was using always the entire spectrum, not only a single slice, because as we said, lasers were not available at the time. So he used the pulsed complete spectrum, which is called white light destruction. There is a company in Germany which brought to the next level this study, and they produce some machines which do exactly this PWLD inactivation of microorganisms.
Very interesting.
But Rife machines also emit visible light. This is also correct. Flash lamps are not lasers. They cannot emit only selected wavelengths. They always emit the entire spectrum of the employed gas. However, through the action of Morse or other means, a particular band in the spectrum is enhanced, which is centered at the value of the absolute More. This is common operation in PWL, pulsed white light devices, which feature a wideband spectrum together with a strong UV content. There are extensive German studies on the subject pointing out that the addition of visible light enhances microbial inactivation. But only visible light without UV works mainly through the thermal effect. It does not have a strong effect like UV and VIS combined together.
Okay.
Does a Rife machine produce X-ray? When a lot of energy is pumped in the plasma tube and the wavelength is centered around the absolute mode of the BX, BY, Salmonella typhi, or similar, it produces soft X-rays. This is due to the broadband nature of flash lamps. The quartz envelope filters out UV content below a certain threshold, but it becomes transparent again in the X-ray range. Rife stated, Verm Thompson used to go down there and take care of Yale's machines. When he began stepping them up and so, he used to slip a little dental film in his hip pocket, you know, with a key or something behind it, and he would work around those things for a few hours. And he found out that he had almost an X-ray out of it. Well, we can confirm from our experimentation that when we reach BX wavelengths, we will also have some soft X-ray.
There's a published journal. It was an application to a research laboratory to ascertain whether the Coolidge tubes did emit X-rays, and the conclusion was that they didn't. So I'm just wondering whether this is just one of several contradictions of Royal Rife, where
yes, let's say
it depends where you go looking.
Let's say initially you had mention of X-rays. Later on, when they tried with Dr. Strafford or the later Crane, they tried to reduce the power of the machines and not get X-rays because they were obviously concerned with the authorities. So they tried to deny it. But it's a simple consideration. An early Rife machine was run at 5,000 volts. He was using an X-ray tube, which was filled with 14 torrs of air. He replaced the 14 torrs of air with 14 torrs of helium. So this means that tube could produce X-ray. Now, X-ray production starts exactly at 5,000 volts. And he was using 5,000 volts. So we have the practical confirmation just from the parameters he was using that he was producing X-ray in his early machines.
And so the modern machines, which promote their machines as being up to 400 watts, will they be producing X-rays by virtue of their power?
If they were tuned correctly with the optical effect, also yes.
Gosh, so that's actually quite dangerous because they do use a fixed carrier and enormous energy levels. And so they're actually producing an X-ray machine.
I know, but I could find only one person modifying a James Bear system who could reach that. I have a Rife Bear machine and it stays well below the infrared. It has no capability to work like a nearly Rife machine unless it is pumped up very much, and it's at 300 watts. So
yes, but machines are being produced now which are 400 watts.
Yes.
So they must be very close, if not over, the point where they're producing X-rays. Some people may be killing bugs by X-rays and killing themselves in the same time. It's quite scary when you think about it.
But in the true, that's not true X-rays. They are soft X-rays.
And what's the difference between soft X-rays and other X-rays?
Basically penetration. Soft X-rays are very short-lived and with very limited penetration.
Okay. So, but they can still cause things like skin cancer or organs which are close to the surface, perhaps?
Well, more should be investigated. I can say if you go to UV around 200 nanometers, you know UV is dangerous, can cause skin cancers, but around 200 nanometers, it cannot even go through the cornea or pass the first layer of skin. So
Okay.
it doesn't pose a risk.
Okay. Now, if the higher frequencies don't have the penetration, how did Royal Rife treat typhoid, which is a full body condition? And so we're not talking about a condition which is a surface tumour. We're talking about a disease that's internal, right in the lungs and other
Yes.
supportive organs. How could his machines have a positive effect, and how could he ascertain the frequency for typhoid if his equipment could only go down to a depth of a few centimeters or inches?
Well, as Rife always stated, much more research is needed. He was working mostly in vitro, and there it works.
Okay.
When it comes to apply it to a full person, to the entire body, much development has to be done yet.
Okay.
Okay, now, is there a difference between an UVC and a Rife machine? Certainly, a UVC machine generally uses mercury, which has a strong peak at 253.7 nanometers. This peak causes DNA dimerization, leading to microbial inactivation. Microorganisms respond differently to the 253.7 nanometer peak. Thus, in some cases, more energy is required. In some other cases, less energy.
Can I ask a question just now?
Yes.
Now, most Rife manufacturers now add mercury to their tubes. They do this to make the tube look brighter because, as you know, mercury makes the
Okay.
beam stronger. Now, does that first paragraph indicate that it's dangerous?
Of course, because mercury in particular has this peak, which is very close to the maximum power to impair DNA. And you know, I think something like 4% of DNA impaired means cancer.
Gosh. And so this is another crazy thing. We know who these manufacturers are. And we know they do add mercury to their tubes, and it makes it easier to strike because it reduces the ionization potential. It makes it nice and bright, and then they can promote it as being a very powerful machine. It looks beautiful, but it actually is causing harm.
Yes, they need to investigate. There are some filters, no? Some paintings, and they can filter exactly that frequency to reduce the harm of mercury, but they can enjoy the other wavelengths of mercury, which are safer.
They're not using any special glass on their tubes. They're just using regular glasses. Wow. Okay, sorry, please continue.
Yes. Okay, conversely, a Rife machine does not target DNA specifically, but a wide array of molecules, microbial chemical constituents. Therefore, it can optimize the energy level required to inactivate a microorganism. This is Rife's real innovation, which requires further investigation.
Okay.
This is what we were talking before. Short duration pulses of a broad spectrum ensure microbial disintegration. The inactivation efficacy of pulsed light depends on the intensity, measured in joule per centimeter square to the -2. A number of pulses delivered. Yes, and those are the two parameters which determine inactivation efficacy.
Yes.
A type of PWL instruments are IPL machines, which are used for hair removal, rejuvenation, and against acne. Acne is somewhat bacteria also, so you have proof they are working. They feature a Pyrex tube and sometimes a doped quartz tube, which filters out the lower UV wavelengths. To operate in PWLD mode, the tube must be changed with a pure quartz one and screens removed.
Okay.
This is what I was saying just before.
Yes.
This model in particular can deliver 20 joule per centimeter square to the -2, which is a lot because a microorganisms usually need 0.0 and something joule per square centimeter, and this is giving 20 joules. So
Yes.
It's very powerful.
Yes.
Using Rife technology or IPL machines for youth, as strange as it might seem, a Rife machine can also be used for photo rejuvenation. In this mode, it removes red splotches, brown spots, scarring, reduces pore size, eliminates and reduces wrinkles, improves overall skin texture, smoothness and quality, closes capillaries. Technically, in order to rejuvenate, it operates by creating many small cracks in the tissue, forcing the triggering of the repair mechanism. The repaired tissue is structurally stronger and confers a younger aspect. Rejuvenation mode needs UV light to be filtered out.
I see it gives you a better shave as well. But it's remarkable. I can see that immediately. On the left,
Yes.
you can see the redness of the skin. That's become...
Yes, it lifts the collagen and all the tissue.
Very interesting.
Oh, the Yarish Herxheimer reaction everybody's talking about.
Yes.
On the top, we have the nose of the patient, and in the middle, there is the mouth. The image is not very clear, but okay. A Herx is the production of endotoxins-like products released by the death of harmful microorganisms within the body during Rife sessions, which resembles bacterial sepsis. So you can see parts of your body turning black with scars, and it can be very frightening. This is the real Herx. When the bacterial cell membranes destruct, there is a consequent release into the bloodstream of the bacterial toxins, resulting in a systemic inflammatory response. Well, aspirin, ibuprofen give limited benefit.
Okay.
Some precautions to use when rifing is drink water often. Avoid unprotected sun exposure for at least 30 days. Do not take a hot bath. Warm is fine. Avoid strenuous activity or exercise for 24 hours. Do not scratch or pick the skin on the treated area during recovery. Avoid any product or supplement high in vitamin A, retinoic acid, glycoic acid, tretinoid, retin A, Accutane, and alpha hydroxy acids. Okay, those are the things I think few people are prescribing, but if you use the Rife optical effect, you must take care of many things.
Okay.
Now we see an example, Streptococcus pneumoniae, which is a gram-positive bacteria. It causes pneumonia. It has a size of 0.5 till 1.25 micrometers. The targeted chemical constituents we could find in this case were polysaccharides, peptidoglycans, tehoic acids, but in particular CH bonds and nucleic acids. The absolute more is 294.5106 nanometers. Now this one is in the UV and is pretty close to the mercury peak of 253 nanometers, if we want to say. Here we are giving it in nanometers, not in the energy actually needed to be used in the beam array.
Okay.
From further research, we found that the UV absorption spectra of two antibiotics against pneumonia, moxifloxacin and cefixime, and a combination of the two, practically have the same absolute more peak that we found. We go back, we go back to 194, and we can see.
Isn't it remarkable?
It's around exactly 290, 294. So this opens a new field of research because, you know, Rife was saying take a drop of blood, put it under the micropolariscope, and through a refraction, you know the chemical constituents, the illnesses, anything. So he was saying everything has a resonance, but we're not talking about audio resonance, we're talking about optical resonance.
Yes. Isn't that amazing? Discovering that must be in a moment where you'd be celebrating. Like you would not believe.
Yes. Yes. Yes, really. And we see that the same wavelength he was using corresponds to the wavelength of common antibiotics for that specific illness. So through a spectrophotometer, we could get the absorption spectra of many medicines, see at which level they work, and see how to supplement them to help our healing process, for example.
Okay. How did you determine the wavelength for pneumonia 2? If you go back to the previous screen, you're saying it's 294?
Yes.
0.5106. How did you determine that?
Okay. Simply, we knew that Rife was using helium. So the first starting point was plotting the spectral output of helium completely.
Yes.
Then we took what we think is the main list of Morse that Rife ever compiled, which is the one he gave Hoyland to check.
Yes.
We plotted it and we obtained a certain curve. Then we knew from Rife some chemical constituents of certain microorganisms. So we checked those molecules and found their absorption peaks, exactly like we did with the antibiotics here.
Okay.
So simply we plotted the spectral lines of helium against the Rife Morse list, and then we got exactly the steps, and it all matched. We found all the sequence of absolute Morse for the microorganisms.
Okay.
And finally, we are at the end. I wrote two books. The first one is the one that contains really the entire research. But really anything you might think of, from even how they were manufacturing the Coolidge tubes, plasma tubes. We developed several custom plasma lamps and holders. We give all the equations to calculate the electrical parameters of a beam Rai. We give schematics for early Rife machines. It's like 700 pages, and it spans over the entire research.
It must have taken a long time to write that one, Fabrizio.
Yes, this one is the outcome of 20 years of work, really. And the next one is just when we found the exact correspondence of absolute Morse and could map all Morse and many more microorganisms. This was written in 6 months and has another 500 pages, and gives also new ways and future means to develop safer Rife systems.
Wonderful. Now, people that are watching this video, I'd like to encourage you to purchase this book from Fabrizio, or the two books. Where can people buy it, please? Where can people find where to buy this book?
Oh, okay, they are all on Amazon.com.
Okay. And if you can just go back to the previous 2 pages so people can perhaps just write down the titles of the books.
Oh, yes. So the first one.
The Cancer Cure That Works. Now that's a fish hook,
Yes.
if there ever was one. Right. And of course, the book that was written a long time ago by Barry Lyons was The Cancer Cure That Worked, or something like that. So this
yes. I gave it as an answer to Barry Lyons, The Cancer Cure That Worked, because now in this book we give the keys and the entire story, how it is supposed to work, and we give working models. And so we change that worked to that works. But obviously, research has to continue.
absolutely. This is a very important step that you've made. In publishing these books, you've given people the tools that they can continue their research in a different direction rather than going in tight little circles. And the second book, if you can go back to that screen again, please.
Yes.
Absolute MOR determination. The secret is out.
Yes.
Courtesy of Fabrizio del Tin. I've got another couple of questions, if I may.
Yes.
The first question is regards to the bandwidth. Now, Royal Rife specified that the frequency has to be within 1/4 of 1% to be effective.
Oh, yes.
And so,
Yes.
but going by the graph that you're showing, where a light source was created, the spectrum of that light source was changing, being modified through the use of a pretty much what can be considered a modulation. It's still quite a broad spectral line. That peak is quite broad still, even though it goes
Yes.
high. And so I'm just wondering why it still needs to be so precise if it has quite a...
Okay. Okay. So the trick is, I'm sorry. The trick is in getting the exact power level at that specific wavelength. So you know, wavelengths require different energy power levels to reach a certain peak. They are classified, if you look at in the NIST, which is the National American Database for Spectral Data, you find near every spectral line its power, which is given in number like 50, 10, 100, 400. So Rife needed to be precise because a certain wavelength could be less powerful than another. And he has to tune many parameters in order to reach the required power to actually do something. But in the true, things are a little different because we found there are 4 main interchangeable bands. If you are in one of those bands, you kill all a series of microorganisms. It's not important that you are so specific. It only depends on the power levels you are using. Rife was optimizing, trying to use the least power to obtain the maximum effect. So he had to be very precise. We don't need these today, I think.
Okay. In one piece of literature, they're talking about a Rife machine being effective through walls and killing mold that is on the walls of the laboratory. If it was through light, then it could obviously not pass through the thick concrete and reinforcing to go to the other side. So how would that work? Would that be just the electromagnetic side doing the...
No, I commented this on the Rife forum. I should take the word by word exactly to comment it. It's simply a misinterpretation. One can read it in one way or another. Let's say it is standard lab practice, like you do in an X-ray hall. When you turn on the machine, doctors, everybody goes out or goes in another room.
Yes.
It was not specified that the sample was in the room below. It says it was below the microscope, not necessarily below the concrete. So it's just a misinterpretation. It cannot work from one room to another and cross a block of concrete.
Okay. Another question I have is regards to the calculations that people have been using to hit the alleged MORs, which is through the use of sidebands. When they're using a fixed carrier, yes, and they're applying a modulation to create sidebands when one of these, in the 35th sideband up, which is 2/3 of nothing power, it hits the MOR. So it's got, from the outside, it appears that that type of application seems to hold water because the maths seems to hold true. When you go through the MORs which were found by Dr. Rife, but was it more because of a more complex?
Yes, in the truth, things are very simple. The need to have sidebands only stems out of the fact that without those, it was quite ineffective because of the low power employed. Sidebands only add, let's say, power, energy. So what happens is you could obtain it by other means. This is maybe a clever way, but it was not what Rife had in mind or was meaning to use. We talked before about laser technology and an electron gun. So sidebands are another way of pumping the tube. So you're pumping it with more energy because you use the sidebands also. That's it. You could use completely another way which could work with more purity and precision.
How? By applying this a single frequency or using a particle generator or a laser?
Well, first, if I had to design a modern Rife system, I would not use Morse anymore because you know, Morse work only with those disks and large electrodes.
Yes.
If you want to use, for example, a flash tube in the place of a Rife tube, it will not work. It will not show the effect.
Okay.
I prefer to use readily available things like flash tubes or arc tubes and tailor the machine to them instead of trying to resuscitate an old technology for which you barely find the components. No?
Well, there is that, and it's hard to repeat something if it's got so many variables which are all dependent upon success. And they're all interdependent. So I guess as a tube ages, because it's very hard for a tube to retain helium, being such a small molecule, so the pressure goes down, therefore the calibration will go out. And so I guess you've got to regularly maintain it. But it's 1930s technology or older, so it's intriguing. The thought of using a part like a laser, I don't know. The accuracy will be much greater.
Yes, for example, I put this picture as the last one.
Yes.
That's, for example, the future. I call it surgical Rife. You produce the exact required wavelengths and deliver them exactly through fiber optics. And you can use it in conjunction with surgery when you operate a patient, and you can go also inside and through his rise, his being, you devitalize the cancer, the microorganisms, or what you need to do.
So that must be producing an ultraviolet wavelength, I guess.
Mostly, well, this one spans from let's say 200 to 400 nanometers.
Okay. So you'd have to wear safety glasses when you
Yes.
operate. Okay.
And a glove.
I wanted to ask one other question as well. We've been talking about Hertzian waves exclusively throughout this discussion. Have you looked into longitudinal waves, the percussion type wave?
Okay, no, we studied mostly the optical effect and didn't deepen those other aspects.
Okay, well, that's amazing. Well, I don't know how to thank you. You've been giving so much information in such a short period of time. Well, 2 hours has gone already, and
Yes.
it's been packed 2 hours. I don't know. When I'm going home tonight, I'll be thinking about ways of applying these ideas you've planted in my head. And people watching this video, they'll be looking at Rife and with totally different eyes now. They'll be realizing that it's not just as simple as pure frequencies, but there's actually more to it. And what Royal Rife was doing through the use of frequencies is generating the correct wavelength, the correct light wave is required to
Yes.
perform the function. Now, I'm quietly hoping that you're wrong insofar as with regards to the light side, because I like to, it doesn't solve the problem with issues which are deep within your body. And so things like a lung cancer where the tumor is deep within the lung, and obviously light will have a bit of difficulty getting to that tissue.
Yes.
So I'm quite
It's not good news overall, but unfortunately, I did not present here, but we have a lot of lab data with many microorganisms, and this way it really works, and we can see it.
Yes, no, it's amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming onto our show. Thank you so much for spending the time to explain to us the deeper sides to Royal Rife. The man was a genius. It's a shame that he took it to his grave, but maybe he didn't know himself the finer details. He knew what was necessary to do the job, but he maybe he couldn't explain why
Yes.
frequencies did this, and now you're putting a science to it. And it's good to see that someone's gone off on a tangent.
Yes.
A wide tangent, may I add, to throw, if you excuse the pun, new light on the subject. Because the Royal Rife is stagnated. The research is stagnated for a long period of time, probably about 20 years. And so that must be when you came on the scene and decided, no, there's got to be more to it than what we're being told. And you've done the hard yards and have come up with some good information. So thank you for coming onto the show. It's been fantastic.
Okay, thanks to you for the opportunity.
Goodbye from me, and goodbye from Fabrizio.
Okay, goodbye everybody. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.